Welcome to the English Epics channel. She closed her eyes, feeling the passion igniting between them. Her breathing quickened, and the warmth of his touch sent shivers down her body. They were so close that it seemed as if the whole world had disappeared, leaving only the two of them. He gently pulled her closer, their bodies moving in harmony, creating a unique atmosphere. His care and desire were evident in every movement, in every touch. She responded to him, following the rhythm of their closeness until a wave of emotions engulfed them both, leaving only their breathing and the silence of the room. When it was over, they lay next to each other, silently enjoying the moment in the quiet. He sat up, grabbed the cigarette, lit it, and took a deep drag. He exhaled the smoke across the room, and it began to mix with the lingering scent of their intimacy. "Joyce, that was fantastic. Truly special," he said. She smiled. "I'm glad. I think it was amazing, too." She moved closer, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. They looked into each other's eyes and shared a soft, tender kiss. "Can you stay?" he asked, hoping she could stay the whole night. He wanted more. "I'm yours all night if you want, darling. Jake's out of town and won't be back until tomorrow evening," she replied. He looked at her, his eyes filled with desire, a smile playing on his lips. He leaned toward the woman and kissed her slowly before putting out the cigarette and turning off the bedside lamp. Joyce Harris was a 42-year-old mother of two teenagers, a son named Zach and a daughter named Louise. For the past 20 years, she had worked in publishing, taking breaks only for the births of her children. Jake, her husband, had always been rather accommodating, yielding to her wishes and needs. When she decided to return to work, he accepted it without hesitation. He even adjusted his own work-life balance to make it possible. Of course, there was no gratitude for it, but he did it for the woman he loved. In her youth, Joyce had always been quite headstrong and eventually grew accustomed to getting her way. There were many times when she and Jake argued over one thing or another, but when Jake stood his ground, which was rare, he was immovable. Joyce would sulk, rant, and at some point grudgingly admit that perhaps he was right, though not without prolonged resistance. Joyce was 163 centimeters tall, fair-haired, and had green eyes. She had a curvaceous figure that attracted attention wherever she went. While she never flaunted it, she couldn't deny the thrill she felt when she noticed someone looking at her. She believed she had missed out on a lot in her younger years, but now she felt secure enough to enjoy the attention. Yes, she felt safe because she was a married woman. Joyce didn't realize that some men saw a married woman as a challenge. Jake worked as a consultant in construction and building design. He was by no means pretentious and often carried out many tasks himself on site. That was just his nature. He was a humble man who could easily go unnoticed in a crowded room. Yet those who knew him valued his opinion and respected his expertise. Standing just over 180 centimeters tall, he was in great shape for his 44 years, with short-cropped blonde hair and gray eyes. He adored Joyce and always gave her everything he could. Even when she threw a tantrum, he would usually smile and let her have her way, until something came up that he couldn't allow. That was a different story entirely. When he said no, it was a firm no, and there was no moving him. Yes, Jake could be stubborn too, which sometimes led to fireworks between him and Joyce. They had been married for just over 20 years, and neither of them had ever cheated on the other. Of course, there had been temptations along the way, and Jake knew there were a couple of guys over the years who had set their sights on Joyce, but nothing ever came of it. He kept an eye on things, but Joyce gave him no real reason to worry. Recently, as their children were on the verge of leaving the nest to pursue further education, a sense of tension seemed to arise in the Harris household. Over the past few months, Jake had been away several times due to his involvement with a national construction company, which had engaged his services for a major new project in the north of England. During this period, he noticed something more. than just physical distance growing between him and his wife. Their lovemaking had, over the years, turned into a once-a-week ritual, which now seemed to have become routine for both of them. Jake observed that his wife was less interested and engaged in their weekly ritual of sex. However, due to his recent travels, he couldn't pinpoint this change to anything specific. Perhaps they were both feeling the effects of their demanding work schedules. The nights they spent together at home were as tender and loving as ever, but they rarely led to anything more intimate. As a result, sex had become more of a scheduled event, and the spontaneity they once had seemed to have disappeared. Things were not going well. Mason James was a typical salesman. He was 38 years old, divorced, but full of confidence, charm, and good looks. Standing slightly over 180 centimeters tall, with very dark, almost black hair and deep brown eyes, he was the embodiment of the classic tall, dark, and handsome archetype. When he first arrived at Joyce's office almost 6 months ago, several women fawned over him. He captured their attention and resembled a wolf surveying a flock of sheep, carefully sizing up his prey. Within a few weeks, it became clear that he had a particular interest in Joyce, and so he began his pursuit. Though he flirted with some of the other women in the office for fun, Joyce was his main target. He saw her as a hot, sexually repressed wife who needed his attention to break out of her shell. He spent much of his visits to the office chatting with her, laying the groundwork for his seduction. During one of his visits a few months ago, he timed his departure from the office to coincide with her arrival and invited her out for a drink. When she blinked and agreed, he knew the game had begun. Joyce came home late that evening after more than just one drink with Mason. She hadn't done anything inappropriate, and Mason had been nothing but charming. There were no lewd comments or suggestive remarks, but there was an electric tension in the air. She could feel it. As they sat in a quiet corner of the bar, she felt his gaze on her, and that alone was enough to send a shiver through her body and stir a physical reaction she hadn't experienced in years. That night, she wanted sex so badly that she nearly pounced on Jake as soon as he walked in. Jake, for his part, was taken aback, but being a man, he wasn't about to question her motives. She was passionate and clearly needed intimacy, and Jake wasn't going to argue. They ended up doing it on the living room floor before moving to the bedroom for a second round. Later, as they lay in bed, Jake looked at his wife, who was dozing off in exhaustion after their unexpected sex. He gazed at her serene face and saw nothing unusual, but something was there. He knew it. He could feel it. It was so out of character, so out of place in their routine. Somewhere deep in his mind, a small alarm bell began to ring. In the following weeks, there were 2 more instances when Joyce was in the same mood, and Jake gratefully went along with the change in his wife, simply going with the flow. Although they never mentioned or discussed it, beyond exchanging a knowing smile the next morning, it was enough of a shift, albeit a welcome one, to make that little alarm bell ring again. Jake began to have doubts. At work, her days were ordinary, but the smallest things seemed to irritate her for no apparent reason. Joyce felt on edge, and it was only when Mason stopped by that she seemed to regain her composure. She fluttered her lashes while looking at him and behaved like a smitten schoolgirl. Mason noticed her reaction, smiled to himself, and took every opportunity to stroke her ego. He always complimented her appearance and outfits, which made Joyce primp and fawn over him whenever they were alone in her office. Drinks after work had almost become a routine, with them meeting at bar and staying later and later each time. If Jake was home, Joyce would text him, citing a meeting or some other event as an excuse. Jake, on his end, would read her messages and hear that damned little alarm bell ringing in the back of his mind every time. There were occasional touches between Mason and Joyce that had been happening for a couple of weeks now. The sensation of his touch sent shivers through Joyce's body, drawing her to him like a moth to a flame. On the 3rd or 4th evening, Mason kissed her as they parted. She was caught off guard but didn't pull away or reprimand him. Instead, she melted into his arms and kissed him back, savoring the feeling of him all around her, his hands firmly, holding her against his chest. When she looked at him, he smiled. He knew she was his now. Soon, he would have her completely and give her the best sex she had ever experienced. "How are you today, Joy?" he asked as he walked into her office the day after their kiss. Joyce looked up at him, smiling, her cheeks burning as she remembered. The kiss. She liked the way he called her Joy. It felt intimate and personal between them. "I'm fine, thank you, Mason. And you?" She stood and walked toward him. He closed the door and, in an instant, pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. She surrendered to him as he explored her body, holding her even tighter against him. "I couldn't stop thinking about you after last night, Joy. I can't help myself. I want to be with you," he said, pulling her closer as he spoke. She looked into his dark eyes and melted, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I do too, baby." "I want to be with you too," she replied, the words escaping her lips before she even thought about them. He kissed her again, more insistently this time, and she responded just as passionately. "Oh my God, Mason, please. I love this. But not here," she said, breathing heavily. "I understand. But when and where?" "I want to be with you," he insisted. Joyce knew she was in deep. Her emotions and needs were driving her, ignoring her family obligations and her husband. She wanted this. She had been heading down this path for the past couple of months, and Mason was the perfect potential lover. Now it was time to make a decision, and her mind was racing, trying to find an answer. Jake is going on a trip next week and will be away for at least 2 nights, so maybe then, she said. Mason kissed her again, and the lovers relished the moment of sealing their pact. Nothing could hold them back now. His hands caressed her, sliding up her sides until his large hands rested on her chest. The ringing of the phone interrupted the moment and their kiss. Fixing her hair and composing herself, she answered the call. "Hello, Joyce." It was Jake. She gestured for Mason to stay silent, and he moved closer to her. "Hi, Jake. Are you okay? It's not like you to call me at work. Is everything all right?" "Yeah, I'm fine, baby. I just wanted to hear your voice, that's all. I was wondering if you're free for lunch. I'm in town today, and I've got an hour or 2 to kill." Mason ran his hand along Joyce's thigh as she perched on the edge of her desk. She watched him with wide eyes while chatting on the phone. "Well, I'm really busy at the moment, Jake. Let me check my schedule," she said. She flipped through her planner as Mason's hand slid under her dress and began moving upward. When she brought the phone back to her ear, the sensations coursing through her were electric. "Sorry, darling. I've only got 30 minutes today. Otherwise, I'd love to meet up. Maybe we can do something tonight instead." Jake seemed disappointed but didn't end the call. Joyce felt herself growing increasingly tense as Mason continued to caress her, all while she listened to her husband talk about his upcoming trip. Mason smiled at her, relishing the thought that while he was touching her, her husband might hear the uneven breathing of a wife feeling someone else's hands on her. Mason watched her face. She blushed but responded by moving her hips toward his fingers. "Jake, I really need to go. Someone is waiting for me here. We'll finish talking at home." "Okay? Yeah, sure, baby. See you tonight," Jake replied. She hung up the phone, and Mason immediately covered her mouth with his. He caressed her faster and deeper, making her tremble and cling to him. When she reached her peak, her body shook. He smiled at her and licked his fingers. He was on edge, himself, but he wanted her to feel indebted to him, so he kissed her again. "I've got to run, baby. We need to get everything organized for next week, and I need you," he said. She melted as she felt him leave her. Taking a deep breath, she tried to collect herself the rest of the day. Joyce spent daydreaming about her lover, blushing at the thought of what he had done while she was on the phone with her husband. She was stunned, ashamed, but so exhilarated that it felt unreal. She considered arranging a meeting with Mason when Jake left next week. He would never find out. It was perfect. She had made the decision to cheat on her husband without giving a single thought to the consequences or outcomes that might follow. Jake had been away for 2 days. He missed his wife and was lying on the bed in his hotel room, resting after another long day with his clients. It had been stressful, but overall, he was pleased with the results. He had secured another recommendation for his consultancy, so things were going well and he felt proud of himself. He wanted to talk to Joyce and tell her about it, but given how things had been between them lately, he wasn't sure she would even be interested. Ever since she had surprised him with her sudden sexual enthusiasm a few weeks ago, things had cooled off and returned to their usual once-a-week routine, leaving him confused. To be honest, he was also angry. The nagging suspicion that something might be wrong between them kept him on edge, making him watch Joyce closely for any signs of wrongdoing. But he had nothing concrete to confront her with, and it frustrated him. He searched the house for anything that might indicate an affair. Sure, she had sexy lingerie, but there was nothing obviously new or unusual, so no changes there. He checked her car, and again, there was nothing out of place. Her phone was off limits since she never left it unattended, so he couldn't check it. The home computer also turned up nothing. Still, he knew there had to be something, somewhere, but where? He was on the verge of admitting defeat, ready to acknowledge that he had a problem and that his insecurity was overtaking his common sense, when he received a text message. The message was anonymous, with no sender's number visible, but the content struck at the core of his deepest fears, making the alarm bell in his mind ring louder, much louder. "Your wife is cheating on you." That was all it said. No details, nothing. Specific. When he read it, it felt like a spear had pierced his chest. He knew. He just knew. It was true. It confirmed his own suspicions, and he believed it. That was 3 days ago. Just 1 day before he left for his trip to the north of England. He had no choice but to go. People were relying on him, but his mind was in turmoil as he read and reread the message. Who? When? Why? He had no idea. He tried replying to the message, but he didn't get any response. Joyce seemed completely normal. It was unbelievable. If this was true, how could she act so normal? Did he even know this woman? He had 1 day to do something about it before he left. He knew this trip was the perfect opportunity for her to cheat while he was away, so he needed to act quickly to protect himself and gather evidence, if there was any. He felt that he would get the answers he needed during the trip. He had no idea how long this might have been going on, or who was involved, or where it was happening. He thought back and calculated how often he had been away recently, every few weeks. But just before this trip, Joyce had been acting differently, not like her usual self. So maybe it hadn't been going on for very long. Now, she seemed to have returned to normal, but was it really normal? Confused, he began rummaging through his address book. He lay stretched out on the hotel bed, thinking about Joyce. He was angry, sad, and lost. The last 2 days had been pure hell. His attempts to push thoughts of his wife and her lover out of his mind were unsuccessful. She had called him on the first evening and made small talk, but it was earlier than their usual calls during his trips, which he found odd. He was tense, and she asked him a couple of times if everything was okay. He brushed her off, saying he'd had a stressful day, and while he loved her, he just wasn't in the mood. Joyce seemed to sense this, and she herself didn't seem eager to talk, probably because she was anxious to finalize plans to meet her lover. They both wanted to end the conversation quickly, though for entirely different reasons, which they both later recognized as a little unusual. Jake was left, feeling sorrowful, while Joyce felt relieved. Jake had a restless night, tossing and turning. It was around midnight when he received a text message from his contact. "All clear tonight, nothing to report." Jake sighed with relief, rolled over, to his other side, and fell into an exhausted sleep. The second day of his trip was busy. There were no messages during the day, and he managed to wrap up his work on schedule. 30 p.m., he headed back to his hotel without receiving any updates. He thought he might finish his report and send it out that evening instead of in the morning, saving himself a few hours the next day. He checked the times for morning flights home and wondered if everything went as he expected, why rush home? Jake sat at the hotel bar. He had finished his report and sent it to his client, and now he was sipping a large Jack Daniels on the rocks. The warming effect of the drink coursed through him, calming him as he thought about the decision he had to make. An hour ago, he had received the message he had been dreading. Joyce had left the house, apparently dressed for a night out. He checked his phone and noticed a missed call from her just minutes before she left. Clearly, it was her way of creating an alibi, but he didn't bother to listen to her voicemail. Now he knew where she was headed and who she was with. He had the guy's address and confirmation that she was there. She had left just after 8 p.m., and 3 hours had already passed. Deep down, he knew his marriage was over. The heavy weight in his chest felt immovable as he finished the last of his Jack Daniels before ordering another. He had stopped praying that this was all some kind of mistake. Now he had no doubt she was cheating on him. Would he even be able to return home tomorrow? He didn't know the answer to that question. His flight was booked for tomorrow around noon, so Joyce wasn't expecting to see him before 3 p.m., and even then she was supposed to be at work. Earlier, a call to her workplace confirmed that she had taken 2 days off, something she had conveniently forgotten to mention to him. She was probably expecting to spend a long day tomorrow with her lover, so he assumed she would text or call him with an excuse about being late. That way, she wouldn't have to worry about him suddenly wanting sex with her. Clever little cheat. Jake knew he couldn't come to terms with her betrayal. The thought of her with another man enraged him and caused him physical pain. No, he wanted his pound of flesh and then, in sum. A quick confrontation wouldn't give him that. So he needed a plan. Yes, a plan for revenge, one that would cause pain to everyone involved, was exactly what he required. After a couple more Jack Daniels, he felt a warm glow settle over him. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly 12:30. There were no messages or updates on his phone, which was a bad sign. Around the same time, Mason turned off the bedside lamp and enjoyed Jake's wife for the second or third time that night. Joyce giggled as his hands roamed over her once again. He loved caressing her chest. She reached out to him with a playful laugh, feeling his renewed energy and affection. Jake had never recovered so quickly, she thought, comparing the moment to her usual experiences. She ran her hand over Mason's chest as he held her close, his touch confident yet gentle. Their connection felt intense, unlike anything she had experienced before. Mason looked at her with a satisfied smile, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're amazing, Joy," he said softly, his tone both reassuring and commanding. She felt a mix of emotions, excitement, nervousness, and curiosity as their chemistry deepened. Mason's presence was magnetic, drawing her in with every glance and word. His confidence and strength were intoxicating, a stark contrast to the familiar comfort she shared with Jake. Later, she found herself reflecting on the moment, unsure how she felt. There was a strange mix of fulfillment and guilt, but she couldn't deny that Mason had awakened something in her. As she lay beside him, she realized how different he was from Jake, how much more assertive and commanding. It left her wondering what she truly wanted and whether she was ready to face the consequences of her choices. Jake. Oh my God, Jake. She suddenly realized where she was, and for the first time that night, thought about her husband. For the first time in what must have been weeks, she felt a pang of guilt as she fully grasped what she had just done. Mason noticed the guilt in her expression. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her firmly. He held her tightly until she began to calm down. He continued to kiss her deeply, and although she hesitated at first, she began to respond. Mason's touch overwhelmed her, pushing thoughts of Jake to the back of her mind. His kisses left her breathless, and his hands caressed her gently yet purposefully, making her feel desired and wanted. He wanted to claim this woman as his own. Within minutes, his hands explored her completely, leaving no part of her untouched. He turned her onto her stomach, and she let out a soft moan, prompting him to lean in and kiss her again. She tried to pull away, but he moved slowly, and she gradually began to relax. "Shoo, baby, just relax. In a minute, it'll feel so good, trust me," he whispered. He moved slowly, kissing and caressing her, teasing and guiding her until he was almost fully inside. She looked at him, partly in shock, but also with a hint of desire, as he continued, starting gently, giving her time to relax and begin to enjoy it. It was as though he was asserting his control over her, marking her as his. Joyce felt herself losing control. What had initially been discomfort transformed into something else entirely. She began to move with him, her body reacting instinctively. When she arched her back and was overtaken by another wave of bliss, she let go completely. When they finished, he smirked as he looked at her, exhausted and sprawled out on his bed. He was still semi-hard, thanks to a pill he had taken earlier. It had served him well tonight. Perhaps he could take her again in the morning. The pair drifted into a deep, satisfied sleep. Jake woke up at 6:30 a.m. after another restless night. He felt terrible, his head pounding, so he decided to head down for breakfast. A good fried breakfast would help, and then he'd have to head home. Home. Well, at least the place he lived. He sat down and ate his breakfast: eggs, bacon, tomatoes, hash browns, mushrooms, and toast. 3 cups of tea later, he started to feel human again, almost normal for God's sake. He had packed his things the night before, so there was nothing holding him back. He paid the bill and took a taxi to the airport. By 9:30 a.m., Jake was leaning back in his seat on the plane. It was a slow day, so checking in for the early flight had been easy. His mind was spinning with tasks, and over breakfast, he had made a list of things to do for the day. At Heathrow, he collected his bags, grabbed a trolley, and headed to the long-term parking lot. He loaded everything into the trunk of his car and drove toward the city. His first stop was his brother's place. He walked straight into the small office and sat down across from a well-built man whose face had clearly seen happier days. "How are you, Jake?" the man asked, without taking his eyes off his computer. "I've been better. Haven't we all?" "How did it go?" Jake asked impatiently. The big man turned fully toward him, and from the look on his face, Jake knew the news wasn't good. "Ah, damn it." Jake buried his face in his hands. "Take it easy, Jake. Yeah, it's bad, really bad. They're still at it." Jake jumped up, walked over to the wall and punched it, leaving a neatly formed hole in the drywall. "Oh, come on, Jake. What the hell did you do that for? Damn it. Anyone else? And I'd lose it." Jake turned to look at his brother. "Sorry, I just can't believe that bastard did this and is still doing it. She knows I'll be home today." "What the hell is going on, Mike? I know who and where, but I don't know why. Only Joyce or the jerk himself would know that." "All right, what have you got?" Jake leaned back in his chair and looked at his brother. The next half hour was spent going through what Mike had gathered, photos of the guy's apartment from the outside. The man was well off, and he was a predator. Mike explained that he'd managed to dig up some information on him, and it seemed like this guy had a thing for other men's wives and girlfriends. It appeared he enjoyed taking them, using them, and then moving on as soon as he had ruined everything for them. So far, Mike had identified at least 2 other women involved, but he suspected there might be more. "He's playing some sick game. Using my wife?" Jake spat in disbelief. "Seems like it. But we still don't know for sure where Joyce stands in all this, Mike replied. Anyway, I'm going to take that bastard down. Take it easy, Jake. We don't want you ending up in jail. I want to ruin that bastard for good so he can never pull this crap again. What about Joyce? As far as I'm concerned, she's already in the past. She made her choice, no one forced her, and she'll have to face the consequences. Mike looked at Jake and saw that unmistakable family stubbornness. He knew it well. It was a trait they both shared. There was no turning back now. All right. So do you know what you need to do today? Mike asked. Jake nodded grimly. Yeah, I've got a list. On the way here, I made some calls. By now, the locks at the house are being changed. The bank accounts have been emptied. I've got a meeting with a lawyer tomorrow morning. Today, I'm heading home to throw her stuff out. Well, to pack it up nicely and leave it for her to pick up. Everything else can wait. Jake, take my advice. Don't stay in the house. Go find yourself a quiet spot for a few days and let the adulteress sweat it out. Yeah, maybe that's a good idea. At your place? Jake asked. Mike tossed him a set of keys. As long as you need. Now get going. You don't want to run into her, do you? Jake turned, walked out the door, and headed home. On the way, he was fuming about what he'd heard from Mike. He needed to check on a few things, and time was running out before Joyce returned home from her sex celebration. He pulled into the driveway near his garage and clicked the remote, but it didn't work. That was confirmation the locksmith had already been there. He stepped out of the car, and as he approached the door, the locksmith hurried over to him, holding an invoice and a set of keys. Mr. Harris, I finished with the locks. Here are the new key sets. I've also reprogrammed the garage opener. This is the new remote for it, the locksmith said. Thanks, I'll stop by later to settle up with you. I really appreciate the excellent service. Great job. He grabbed the man's hand and gave him a warm handshake. Sorry, I'm in a rush today. Hey, no problem, man. Glad I could help. Good luck to you. The locksmith turned and left Jake at the front door. Once inside, Jake moved quickly. He went upstairs. With a bundle of black garbage bags and unceremoniously emptied all of Joyce's clothes into them. Without hesitation, he tied the bags and tossed them down the stairs to the front door. In total, there were 20 bags packed in record time. He saved her jewelry for last, carefully packing it into a box before placing it in his car. He gathered some fresh clothes for himself and packed them in the car, along with personal documents and anything he might need over the next few days. Time flew by, and when he checked the clock, he realized he had been in the house for 2 hours. It was already past 1 p.m. Jake decided he was done. He wrote a note, pinned it to the door, and placed it in an envelope with Joyce's name on it. Take that, you cheat. He piled her belongings in the middle of the front yard. There was no way she could miss it. He smiled grimly to himself as he pulled out of the driveway. Glancing over his shoulder one last time, he pressed the accelerator and sped off. Joyce woke up and looked around the unfamiliar room before realizing where she was. A wave of panic washed over her as she checked the time on the bedside clock. It was just past 8:30 a.m. She tried to move, but every bone and muscle in her body ached. She felt as though she had run a marathon. Everything was sore and throbbing. She slid out of the large bed and shuffled into the bathroom, where she splashed water on her face. Looking into the large mirror, she was stunned by what she saw. Her makeup was a mess she hadn't removed it the night before. Dark circles ringed her eyes, but what really caught her attention was her chest. Oh my God. She raised her hand in shock as she noticed 2 bite marks on her chest. They were large enough to be clearly visible. What had she done? She heard him moving around in the bedroom. Panic rising, she rushed to confront him. What the hell have you done? Look at this, she exclaimed, pointing to the love bites. Tears streamed down her cheeks as reality began to sink in. Don't they look amazing? I love them. Come here, let me give you a few more, baby, he said with a smirk. Are you kidding me? If Jake sees this, he'll throw me out. "Isn't that what you wanted, baby?" he replied with a grin. Joyce was stunned. Who was this jerk? What the hell had she done? She needed to get out of there and back home before Jake returned. She began gathering her clothes, still wearing what was clearly inappropriate for a married woman. She returned to the bathroom and stepped into the shower, determined to at least start getting herself together. She washed and scrubbed, trying to wash away the shame and all traces of what had happened. She felt violated in a way she never had before, and the pain in her lower back was a constant reminder. It ached deep inside. She scrubbed and cleaned until there was nothing more she could do. Her hair was washed and tied back as she dressed and braced herself to face her lover in the bedroom. When she looked at him, there was no remorse in his expression. He was lying naked on the bed, casually watching her. "Are you sure you don't want to stay a bit longer, baby?" he asked with a smile. "Jake's coming home today. I need to get home and get myself together." Why did I do this? Well, if you change your mind, Joy, I'm here, and I'll take good care of you, he said, smiling. Joyce was frantic. She had a huge problem to deal with, and time was slipping away faster than she realized. It was already close to 10 a.m. His flight isn't until the afternoon, like you said, so you've still got plenty of time to have some coffee and figure something out, baby, Mason said. He got out of bed, walked to the kitchen, still completely naked, and turned on the coffee maker. As Joyce followed him, her mind raced to process what he had just said. She was panicking. Mason poured 2 cups of coffee, and she took a sip, lost in thought. After a few minutes of silence, she decided her main problem was how to hide the bite marks, as Jake couldn't possibly know anything else. Feeling slightly calmer, she allowed Mason to wrap his arms around her and suddenly realized he was getting aroused again. Mason had sex with her again, and she didn't need much convincing. He was persistent, and though it took some time, he managed to get her to strip before they were at it again. It was already past 1 p.m. when she took another shower and finally headed home, her face glowing with an almost unbelievable radiance. Sitting in the back seat of the taxi, she checked her makeup, now adjusted to better suit a daytime look for a woman her age. As the taxi pulled up to her house, she noticed a strange pile on the front lawn while paying the driver. "Could you wait here for just a minute, please?" she asked distractedly, her eyes fixed on the heap of black bags. A foreboding feeling washed over her, and she felt a chill in her chest. Her breathing quickened as she walked closer to the pile. Bending down, she opened the top of one of the bags and peeked inside. She instantly recognized some of her clothes. No, 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 no! She ran to the front door, frantically grabbing her keys and fumbling with one, trying to fit it into the lock. She tried again, not understanding that the lock had been changed. This can't be happening. This can't be happening. While she struggled to comprehend why her key wouldn't work, she noticed an envelope taped to the door. She snatched it and tore it open. "Adulteress, you've been caught. You vile creature, I know what you did. Now, you and your lover will face the consequences. This is just the first part. I'm throwing you out as of this moment, so go back to your lover. I will not tolerate you near me. I'll be informing our children about what you've done. They might already know. So when your phone starts ringing, you'll realize they know what I know. From this moment, we are done. My lawyer will be in touch. From your loving, soon-to-be ex-husband." Joyce collapsed on the doorstep, tears streaming freely down her face. Suddenly, the enormity of what she had done hit her like a tidal wave. The taxi driver saw her fall and got out of the car. "To hell with this. Another crazy woman," he muttered. He helped her up and guided her back to his taxi, offering some comfort, as he asked for the address of a place where he could drop her off. Her phone began buzzing, making her cry even harder. She ignored the call, letting it go to voicemail. A minute or two later, it buzzed again. But she ignored it once more, tears streaming down her face like rain. The taxi pulled up to the curb, and Joyce stumbled out. shaky and unsteady. The taxi driver waved her off, watching as she staggered up the pathway toward the house door. She wiped her eyes as she walked. The door opened, and an elderly woman stood there, pulling her into a tight embrace. The driver shook his head as he drove away, piecing things together. He realized she was in deep trouble. Her disheveled appearance and the fact that she'd clearly been out all night suggested she'd been caught in some kind of scandal, likely by her husband. He felt a twinge of pity for her situation, but at the same time, it seemed she had brought it on herself. Joyce stumbled into her mother's living room and collapsed onto the couch, clutching the note Jake had left her. Rain, her mother, took the piece of paper and read it. Her hand flew to her mouth as she finished, and she turned to look at her daughter. "What the hell have you done? From the looks of you, I assume you were out all night. Is that it? Have you been cheating on Jake?" Joyce looked at her mother with red, swollen eyes and could only nod, sobbing. "It was a mistake, Mom, honestly. It was just one time. I couldn't help myself. It was only once. Once is enough. Do you love this man? Are you planning to leave, Jake?" "No, well, I don't know. I'm confused." "I don't think so, maybe," Joyce stammered incoherently. But it was just one time. The next few hours were harrowing for Joyce, as her parents and later her children made it very clear how they felt about her infidelity. Her parents were heartbroken and outraged at her behavior. Jake had called her father and shared as many details as he felt her father could handle, explaining why he couldn't take her back. He also contacted their children, and after meeting with him, they too cut off contact with Joyce. In the end, she had no one left who would stand by her side. Mason didn't care about the chaos he had caused. The divorce papers were filed quickly, and the photographs provided were damning on their own. While there was no video evidence of the actual act, the pictures taken through the window, along with the timeline, were enough to prove that Joyce had spent the night with Mason. Joyce couldn't offer any explanation that was coherent or even remotely plausible to justify her behavior. She resigned herself to the outcome. Mason, meanwhile, was labeled a first-class jerk in the eyes of the office staff and was forced to resign within 2 weeks after Joyce and Jake's marriage fell apart. On his last day, he went to a bar and, as usual, sat there eyeing the women. He didn't even notice the stocky guy and his friend who walked in a few minutes later. The next day, he was found in his car, beaten nearly to death. He had been subjected to a brutal and systematic beating from head to toe, a very thorough job indeed. Even his pride and joy hadn't been spared, and as for his family jewels, well, they would never be of use again. He was alive, but just barely. The answer to the question about the original anonymous text message. Well, it took some time, but Mason eventually confessed that he had sent the messages himself. It was all part of the thrill he got from destroying relationships. It was his twisted hobby, sleeping with women while knowing their husbands were either aware or at least suspicious of what was happening, all while ensuring it was too late to stop the act. That was the reason his jewels got smashed. He was cold and calculated in his pursuit and seduction of his chosen targets. Perhaps he had been successful in his schemes before, but this time it was the end of the line. As for Jake, he didn't forgive his wife. It simply wasn't in his nature. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. Even if it was just one time, that was more than enough. Thank you for listening until the end. See you in the next episode of English Epics. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.